It's 10 o'clock, so I think we'll start. Julie has a couple of slides just to introduce the sessions. So she will be presenting them, just sharing them.
All right, I want to do that. Oops, I pressed do that.
No, yours.
This one.
Okay, so this is, so welcome everyone. Here you've got the basic rules we have to all follow. Mute your microphone if you're not presenting or making an intervention. Turn off your video. Of course, we want to see everyone, but if you're prompted by Julie to turn off your video because we have internet instability or whatever reason, please do so. Presenters have 20 minutes and 10 minutes for question and discussion. Sessions are recorded. And just a reminder, and will be available in Dropbox. And just a reminder, the next session is November 4th, Montreal time. Now, today's schedule.
Oops.
Okay, so I must apologize. I start with that. I had a series of events in my personal life that made me, it turned impossible for me to finish the presentation that I was supposed to give today. And given the series of problems, I don't want to tell you too much about my personal life, but I won't be able to present anything in the coming weeks. So we were down to 2 presentations, and right now we're having trouble contacting Cécile Bureau-Dubois, who was supposed to be the second presenter. So if Cécile does not contact us very soon, we will be down to 1 presentation, which give more than 20 minutes to the first presenters and the first presenters, and more time to discuss their work if they wish to take 30 minutes instead of 20. There's absolutely no problem for that. So Julie, will turn the screen to Eva. Eva, did you hear me? Just unmute your microphone.
Yes.
Okay, that's great.
Can you hear me well?
I'm sorry?
Can you hear me well now?
Right now, yes. So if you want to take more than 20 minutes, you can do that. Don't exceed 30. If you're more comfortable with 20, I mean, you were asked to prepare a 20-minute presentation, 20 minutes will be fine. But usually people feel a bit short in 20 minutes, so maybe you may want to take advantage of the circumstances. So here you go.
It's gonna be around 20 minutes, but I'll just.
Okay, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay. I was just offering you a possibility, but it's just a possibility. It's an option.
So I did share my screen before, so Julie can activate it, or do I have to screen this?
Now we're losing you.
Do I have to share my screen again, or now Julie can activate? Okay.
Well, it's better if you control your own presentation. Looks great.
Okay. So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon to those who are in Europe. First of all, huge thanks to the organizers for putting this program together in spite of all of the obvious obstacles.
Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We're hearing about half what you say, so just stay close to your mic.
Is that better?
It's much better. I think Cécile just connected. I'm sorry for the interruption, but we've got a Zoom is fine, but I mean, so I'm sorry. I will give you Okay. You start your presentation and Julie will check with Cecile whether or not she's there. Okay, so I won't interrupt you for 20 minutes.
Perfect.
Whatever.
So I'm very happy to present this joint work with Luca Pesanda, in which we studied the effectiveness of laws that increase the legal minimum age of marriage in reducing early marriage in low and middle income countries, as well as the effects of these laws on
Excuse
women.
me, Eva, I'm sorry, but
Can't hear
really,
you.
really, we have problems here.
Let me try with the earphones.
Okay, now it's better.
Any chance this is better?
No, that's worse. But
Or why that?
The second speaker has appeared on the screen, Bourreau.
okay,
I'll just try to be as close as possible.
that's better.
Yeah.
So
next-
our motivation. Hello. So the motivation for this work for us was that although early marriage is recognized to be a harmful and discriminatory practice, still over 700 million women alive today are estimated to have married before the age of 18. And this is mainly the case in low and middle income countries. And over time, in many countries, there has been no change in early marriage prevalence. So it's a topic that attracted a lot of international attention. And on the side of the governments, there have been increasing efforts to introduce legislation that aims to curb early marriage. So we've looked into the literature that analyzed whether these laws in fact reduce the prevalence of early marriage. And on the one side, on the positive side, we found some studies that provide evidence of a significant association between these protective laws and lower rates of early marriage. However, on the other hand, we found research that suggested that these laws are not really enforced. And what's worse, this enforcement is not improving over time. So based on this literature that we looked into, we think that still the knowledge about the proper functioning of these laws, and especially across a diverse set of contexts, is limited. And it's important to explore whether these laws in fact reduce the prevalence of early marriage, given the positive consequences of delaying marriage can have on women's various outcomes related to health and well-being, as well as their human capital opportunities. So there's a literature that found positive effects of later aged marriage on women's educational outcomes in low and middle income countries in terms of additional years of schooling or higher literacy or probability of obtaining some secondary education. So the evidence is there, it's very strong. Although, as you can see, the existing studies, they rather focused on exploring this association in terms of somewhat lower levels of schooling, so literacy or secondary school education. And what we've identified is that currently there is lack of research on the effects of later aged marriage on women's higher education or university-related outcomes. And we think it's an important gap in knowledge, given the increasing attention to closing gender gaps in schooling at that level in low and middle income countries. So we know that the gender gaps in primary education and secondary education have substantially decreased in low and middle income context. In some, even women have higher levels of education, but these gaps in higher education are quite persistent. So we believe that the study of the relationship between the age of marriage and higher education attendance can enhance the understanding of the root causes, as well as policy levers to tackle these gender imbalances. So in this research, we have two aims. I'm sorry, I need to navigate this side panel because it obscures part of my presentation. Okay. So first of all, our aim is to explore the extent to which changes in the minimum age-ed marriage laws are effective in reducing early marriage in low and middle income countries. And we focus on three broad regions: Sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, and South Asia. For each of these regions, we study 2 countries. Our second aim is to investigate, in the context where these laws prove to be effective, whether delays in the age of marriage that these legal changes bring about, whether they might increase women's likelihood of higher education attendance. So in terms of the data that we use to address our aims, we combine information from demographic and health surveys and multiple indicator cluster surveys that give us information about women's age, their age at marriage, as well as education. We combine this information with a Prosper Child Marriage database from McGill University. And this database provides longitudinal information on the changes in laws in relation to the age at marriage. So in this table, you can see the countries that we explore, the surveys that we use, also the time when the respective in each country law was implemented. Important information here is that in the red is highlighted in red, and it tells us that in all of the countries after the law implementation, in none of the countries women are legally allowed to marry before the age of 18. As I mentioned, one of our aims was to study these processes across a diverse set of contexts. And you can see that we look at countries that vary substantially in terms of the early marriage prevalence, as well as the higher education attendance. And so prevalence of early marriage ranges from around 8% in Kazakhstan to almost 50% in Nepal. When it comes to higher education attendance, it's very low, especially in sub-Saharan African countries like Benin, Mauritania, and it reaches up to 40% in Kazakhstan. In terms of the methods, we use the regression discontinuity design. And this method involves comparing women who were aged just below and just above the minimum age at marriage at the time of the law implementation. So our treatment groups are women whose ability to marry before the age of 18 was changed by the law, while the control group are women whose ability to marry was not changed by the law. So by comparing these 2 groups of women, in terms of the prevalence of their early marriage, so the marriage before the age of 18, we are trying to find an indication of whether these laws in fact reduce early marriage prevalence. In the context where that is the case, based on the assumption that women's exposure to the change in the law is exogenous, we try to capture the causal effect of early marriage on the likelihood of higher education attendance. So this assumption is very important, and it basically means that treated and control groups, they are comparable on both observed and unobserved characteristics, and they only differ in terms of their exposure to the law. So regression discontinuity design in an easiest way is implemented by the 2-stage least square because it's equivalent to instrumental variables approach. And this is something that we do, but we mainly, the results I will show you today mainly come from the bivariate probit models. And we largely focus on these models because of the nature of our variables. So to tell you a little bit about the indicators that we use, our outcome variable is a binary indicator of whether a woman entered higher education. And our treatment indicator is a binary indicator again for whether a woman married before the age of 18, which we instrument using also a binary indicator for exposure to the minimum age at marriage law. So you can see all of our variables are binary. That's why we rather focus on these bivariate probit models, because they explicitly allow us to account for this dichotomous nature of our variables. So first, I wanted to show you some descriptive statistics and some basic information about our treated and control groups. So in the first column, you can see the age groups that we study in terms of how old women were at the time of the law implementation. And in the two last columns, the four last columns really, you can see some very basic descriptive statistics. And the first thing to notice is that in terms of the prevalence of marriage before the age of 18, we can see that in almost all of the countries, except for Mauritania, women who are in our treatment group, they have a lower prevalence of early marriage. However, this difference often is quite small, like for example, in the context of Benin. Nonetheless, we do observe that women who are subject to the law, they have lower, the prevalence of early marriage among them is lower. In terms of higher education attendance, women in the treatment group across all of the countries, again, in some cases, this difference is small, but they appear to have the prevalence, the attendance of higher education among them is higher. So this is like the first indication that what we expect to be going on is actually happening. But we explore this in greater depth. So I'll show you now a set of plots that present the proportion of women that entered their first union before the age of 18 as a function of their age at the law implementation. So this is just in the first place a plot for Tajikistan. And what you can see here are two lines corresponding to our treatment and control groups. So with the solid line, you can see a trend in the prevalence of early marriage among our control groups, so women who are not exposed to the law. And with a dotted line is presented a trend of prevalence of early marriage among women who are exposed to the law. So we can quite clearly see here that women who are in our treatment group, so the ability to marry was changed by the law, the prevalence of early marriage among them is lower. And there is quite a visible discontinuity at the threshold that separates our treated and control women. So this is somewhat an indication, the first indication for us that this law did indeed reduce prevalence of early marriage. These are the plots pertaining to all of the countries. So this is the same plot for Tajikistan that I've just showed you, and the 5 remaining countries. So I'm not going to go one by one through all of those plots. I want to just highlight the most important findings. So first of all, similar change after the law implementation in terms of early marriage is visible in Nepal. However, in other countries, if you look closely, we do not observe this kind of discontinuity. So for example, if you focus on Kazakhstan or Bhutan, we can see that the prevalence of early marriage, the trend among women who are subject to the law is somewhat downward, but we can also see that this trend is somewhat a continuation of a downward trend from before the law implementation. So in these contexts, we do not have strong evidence that this law indeed contributed to reducing early marriage among women. And this is the case in all of the countries except for Tajikistan and Nepal. So our first conclusion is that these laws work only selectively. This is something that we also see in regression analysis. So these are results from the ordinary release well models and probit models. We can see that only in Tajikistan and Nepal, there is a statistically significant association between being exposed to the law and early marriage prevalence. So women who were in our treatment groups, they have lower prevalence of early marriage by 5 to 8 percentage points, and this is only in Tajikistan and Nepal. So only in the context of these two countries, can we exploit the law, the implementation of the law as an instrument and study the effects of early marriage on women's higher education attendance. So I'll walk you through this table. It shows the results of our bivariate probit models in terms of marginal effects for these two countries. So the first thing to note is what we've seen already in the previous table, that women who were in our treatment groups, who were exposed to the law, they have a lower probability of early marriage. Another important statistic here is that pertaining to the relationship between early union and higher education attendance. So what this coefficient means is that women who married early, so before the age of 18, they have a much lower probability of entering higher education by 35 percentage points. So an important thing to highlight here is that these bivariate probit models, they account for endogeneity of early marriage and higher education attendance. The same association is visible for Nepal, but it's bigger in magnitude. So women who are subject to the new law that increased the minimum age of marriage to 18, they have a lower probability of early union by around 10 percentage points, and women who marry early have a lower probability of higher education attendance by more than 50%. So we do find a strong evidence that postponement that has been induced by the law in these two countries indeed has a positive effect on women's educational outcomes. An important thing to notice here is that the magnitude of these results of our effects is quite large. And also these results that pertain to the effects, they are somewhat larger than the coefficients that we get from simple probit models that do not account for endogeneity. And these are presented in the last column. So we pondered quite a bit about this to think whether we are getting plausible results. And so we try to find literature that touched upon this topic, although we were not able to identify any studies that actually explored the relationship between early marriage and higher education attendance. We found one study in the US that looked into the effects of early marriage on poverty. And interestingly, the study found, in terms of a magnitude, a very similar effect of early marriage on poverty, but of course in the opposite direction, as we find here for the effect of early marriage on higher education. So we thought that possibly in low and middle income countries where education attendance is not widely diffused and it has very important consequences on women's social mobility, possibly higher education could be perceived as somewhat an inverse of poverty in the high income context. So this made us think that, well, these results are not too big to be deemed unreliable, but we will be very curious to hear your thoughts. So to conclude, what we found... Hello?
2 minutes left.
What we found on a negative side is that significant reductions in early marriage following the policy changes are found only in 2 out of 6 countries. On the positive side, in countries where changes in the age of marriage laws are effective, women are significantly more likely to attend some form of higher education. So overall, what we show in this study is that the effectiveness of these policies is very context specific. And also what we argue is that policies to be effective, for these policies to be effective, it's not, the law implementation is not sufficient. So these changes in laws must be accompanied by better enforcement and also monitoring to actually induce change in women's marriage behavior. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. I read your paper and your presentation was pretty close to your paper, so that's really great. We've got at least 10 minutes for questions, comments. So anyone who wants to ask a question, make a comment, just use the blue and you can raise from the participant window, and Julie will monitor the hands and give everyone a chance to ask questions. I may make comments myself or speak with the people who will be asking questions or making comments, but Julie will be giving the cue for questions. Okay, everyone knows how to use to raise their hand with Zoom. So I see that Susanna wants to make a comment or ask a question.
Yeah, just a question. I was thinking about the control of fertility or childbearing. If you have in these countries, how childbearing would affect this model. So if you can comment on that, because I'm thinking about how in Brazil, sometimes you have the laws, but you have people having children, they may get licensed to marry. So maybe marriages are very affected by childbearing or pregnancy before marriage. I don't know in these countries how it happened.
I think that's a great comment, and it's something that
Get closer to your microphone, please.
I think your papers are muffling your microphone, so we are hearing, Eva, your papers on your microphone. So maybe it's that something is muffling your microphone. This is why we are hearing some differences in the volume that you were talking. But I'm not sure. Something is happening there.
So, but you hear me well or no?
Yeah, now yes, but it goes up and down.
I'm not sure why that is the case, so I'll be very close. So I think that's a great question, and it's something that we didn't explore, but actually in this Prosper database, there is, because in some countries there are of course exceptions to these laws. For example, women can marry before the age of 18 with parental consent, and that's only in the case of Nepal, in the case of our countries. But I know that some countries also have special provisions in case of pregnancy. So possibly, and I have not looked specifically, but I think the database does provide information about that. So we could see in which countries, in case of pregnancy, the marriage before the age of 18 could be allowed, and possibly to some extent this is responsible for the fact that we, in some of these countries, we do not see the effect of the law if the levels of premarital childbearing are high. So we haven't looked into that, but we will.
Thank you.
I don't see any other blue hand, so I'll give myself the right to make a comment and ask a question. Okay, we don't see your PowerPoint right now, but on what is your table 4, if I'm not mistaken, which are the results of your be very probit.
This one?
Table 4, yes. Whoops. Okay. The 2 rows are very high, almost 0.99 in one case and 0.86 in the other one. You don't talk about that in your paper. I think it makes a lot of sense given the data and model, your equations, the model you're using and the equations you're estimating. You don't basically have controls, or very few of them, only religion, actually, if I understand correctly what I read. So it means that a lot of the variables that might explain your two dependent variables, you don't know about them. They're unobserved. So using estimating the correlation between the unexplained variance, because basically that's what rho does, is a very nice way to get a clean estimates of what you're interested in, your treatment. And so I think it's pretty well done in your table 4, which is one way to say that I'm not too sure that the your linear probit model or your two-stage d-squared model are really interesting, because you cannot achieve with them what you're doing in your table 4 with your bivariate probit. So if I would encourage you to concentrate on your use of your bivariate probit, even for the 4 countries for which it's obvious that there's no effect, because I think what you do in your table 4 with the probit is it's much better choice. But that's my my advice. What you do with what you want with my advice. What's your reaction? Do you think it makes sense or not?
So as compared to which model? Because
well, you don't have controls basically, except religion for I think 2 countries. So what you have in your linear probit model and your probit linear probability model and your probit in table 3, you don't have anything to control the effect of the unobserved variables, unobserved characteristics that obviously have an effect on your dependent variables. But using the bprobit and estimating rho in table 4, you do it. You do that. So I think the really convincing results are your graphics, which are very simple but very clear and very convincing, and your use of bivariate probit in table 4. I think the rest is not so much convincing, and well, I would stick to the bivariate probit if I were in your place.
Yes, thank you for that comment. Yes, I should have talked more about this.
We don't hear you.
Thank you for the comment. It's true. I should have mentioned the raw value, and indeed, what it means. It's highly statistically significant, which means that there is this unobserved. There are unobserved characteristics. There's unobserved information that we are not accounting for if we were to, for example, consider results of the probit model. So the reason why we focus so much on these descriptive results and the plots is because in the end, it's a regression discontinuity design. So we need to ensure that indeed there is this discontinuity to be able then to well, to be sure that these further assumptions that these models imply later on are satisfied. But I'm very happy to hear that you're convinced by this bivariate probit, because, well, usually it's easiest to implement this model using a two-state least square, which was something that we did not opt for. And focusing on these biprovit models, we thought that was a better way to go. So I'm very happy to hear your comment.
Thank you. I do not see any other blue. Yes, Luca Maria.
Hi. Well, first of all, nice to meet you all. I just wanted to say something as I am a co-author on this paper, and
We just lost you, I think.
That we use very few, excuse me?
Okay, because we lost you for a couple of seconds.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying that given the data that we're using, we have very little variables that are retrospective that we could use as controls. So we're still struggling a little bit in the analysis on how to come up with some controls that we could reliably build on the DHS merged with this Prosperet database. And if you have any suggestions on which other controls we could use and build reliably retrospectively with the data at hand, that would be very useful. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any other raised hand. So I think we can move to the second presentation by Cécile Bourreau-Dubois. Cécile? I thought she was there.
She was there. Hold on a minute.
Can you send her a message?
I will do that. I chat with her during, and everything was fine for her. So let me send her an email.
So while we're trying to catch back Cécile, I'll just remind you that the papers you're presenting ideally should be published together, and our plan is to organize publication of a special issue of some demographic journal. So Eva and Luca, if you're interested in being part of that publication, just send Gilles and I an email, and we will start working with you for that project.
So she sent me an email saying that she was ejected to the Zoom conference, and so she tried to connect again.
Okay, but who would have done that?
I have no idea. So maybe we can wait a few more minutes time to give her for connect again.
Okay, she's back. Cécile?
Yes, yes, I'm sorry. I was ejected from Zoom.
Okay,
I think it's okay now.
okay, we're glad we have you back.
Okay.
So it's your time for presenting. So just, I think you're supposed to be able to share your presentation.
Yeah, I will do.
So just do it.
Yeah. I'm looking for my presentation. I have to find it's different from the one I put in the Dropbox. In the Dropbox, I made some changes, so that's why I wanted to make a change. I'm looking for it. This one.
It seems to be working.
It's okay. Yeah.
Okay, so just start the
Yeah. The diapo. Yeah.
Okay, great.
So, thanks for your attention.
So we're listening.
So I have 20 minutes.
You've got 20 minutes and Judy is counting.
Okay. So I must warn the audience that my paper will be quite different from the paper of Eva. I'm going to talk about theoretical questions. I'm going to speak about Western rich countries, and I'm going to speak about divorce and not marriage. So it's quite different from the previous paper. So it's a paper I did with a colleague, Myriam Doria-Duban, and it was published in a review called Population some years ago in 2016. We are both economists and we are working in France at the University of Lorraine. The field of expertise of my colleague is law and economics, and my field of expertise is social policy. And we very often work together on subjects which are located at the intersection between these two fields of expertise. The origin of the paper is an interdisciplinary research funded by the French National Research Agency and some years ago. And the issue of the research was a question of the theoretical, empirical, legal, and economic grounds of alimony. Alimony is the mechanisms, the compensation paid by the wealthier spouse in case of divorce to the benefit of the less wealthy spouse. And the origin of such a question is twofold, and it's quite well known in the literature on this subject. The first fold is the fact that during the second part of the 20th century, we assist to the increase of the employment rate of women, which results in a kind of financially independence for them. And the second foundation of the issue is the no-fault revolution in family law, which implies that there is no more need to compensate the innocent victim in case of divorce. So in that context, the question is why the law still maintains the principle of an alimony. And that was the core of our research, which in France was quite it was a subject which was not studied in France, neither by economists, neither by jurists. And these questions led us to widen the focus of the analysis, and we ask more general questions which are addressed in this paper. And these questions are the following: who should support the economic cost of separation, the family, the market, the state, and what are the existing or possible mechanisms for covering this cost? And in this context, what is the specificity of the coverage provided by alimony? And more precisely in this article, the aim was to produce a framework to compare the different tools for covering the cost of divorce in contemporary Western societies. And the second aim of the paper was to characterize the respective role of the state, the market, or the family in covering the cost. And as we are economists, we use tools of economics, and we borrow some concepts from social policy economies, from risk economics, and from legal economics. And I must precise that in the rest of the presentation, I will use the term of divorce in a very large meaning. It's a shorter way to speak about breakdown or breakup of legal or common law unions. So I will use divorce in a very large meaning. As for the analytical work, the analytical framework we develop, we consider that divorce is in the same time a private economic risk and a social risk, and I will develop these points on the next slide. And on this basis, the paper focuses on the different tools that may protect the individuals and the society from this risk. And we show that there are three main actors: the state, the market, and the family, which participate to the coverage of the divorce cost in different ways, either directly by playing the role of insurer, or more indirectly by playing a role of regulation, of regulator, and it's specifically the role of the states. For my presentation, I will do it in 2 points. First, I will explain why we consider that divorce can be considered as a private economic risk. And in second point, we will insist on the fact that divorce is a risk which involves the intervention of the state. So let's start with the divorce as a private economic risk. First, it's an economic risk in the sense that for an economist, an economic risk is an event which can be associated with a probability of occurrence and with an amount of damage. And in the divorce fields, the demograph can produce divorce rates according to the marriage duration, for instance. So we know the probability of occurrence according to the duration of marriage. And economists are able to assess the value of the damage induced by the divorce. And for instance, there are different types of costs. There are direct and short-term costs, like the judicial proceedings cost, and above all, the loss of living standard due to the reduction of the economies of scale, due to the separation, which implies the split into two households. And there are also indirect and short-term costs. And in this, well, concerning this indirect and short-term cost, we are talking about the consequences of the specific and domestic investment done during the marriage by one of the couple, and mostly the wife. And such investments leads to a loss of income compared to the level of income of someone who wouldn't have done this specific investment. And this loss of earning is only potential if the marriage lasts, whereas this loss becomes real when there is a marital separation. Secondly, we consider it's a private risk in the sense that it concerns the wealth of the members of the couple, and in the sense that the occurrence of the risk depends on one or on both spouses. And for this specific reason, we consider that it's not to the society to cover the individuals against this type of risk, and it's not a social risk in the social policies acception meaning, but the individuals are concerned to, well, it's up to the individuals to cover themselves against this type of risk. And on the basis of this statement, if we consider that divorce is a private economic risk, two questions may be raised: how to cover, how to ensure individuals against this risk. And second questions, what could be the limits of such different types of coverage? And we use two criteria to assess the quality of the coverage. We assess the different types of coverage in terms of efficiency. And the question is the magnitude of the coverage. And the second point is the equity criteria, to what extent the low incomes could be excluded from this type of coverage. Do it mean that I took my 20 minutes? There was, I heard something, no? Okay.
You
It
got
was just
10
someone
minutes left.
joining the meeting.
Okay.
You got 10 minutes left.
Okay. So we identify different ways of covering individual against the economic consequences of divorce, and to compare these different types of coverage, we retain 4 criteria: the nature of the coverage tools, the type of coverage, and the type of insurer, meaning as a funder who pay for the compensation. So as we distinguish 3 nature of coverage: the coverage provided by the family solidarity, and we refer there to alimony or marriage contracts provided by or framed by the family law. In this case, the insurer is the wealthier spouse. And we make a difference with the two other types of coverage: the collective solidarity coverage, or the individual coverage, which are grounded on market logics. The first one, collective solidarity, is based on the principle of risk pooling. And the idea is that a private insurer could cover individuals against this type of risk in return of the payment of an insurance premium. And the third category of insurance is the personal insurance provided by the individual itself, who may save or work to have precautionary savings, or the aim is to stay in the labor market to preserve the value of the human capital for individuals. All these tools present some limits in terms of efficiency and in terms of equity. I won't develop all points, but in terms of efficiency, the idea is that for different reasons, they all offer a partial or a non-systematic coverage for the individuals who get divorced. For instance, if we take the example of alimony, the ex-spouse and the creditor is not necessarily sufficiently solvent to cover all the damage, and or the amount of the alimony fixed by the judge may be null or very low and can't compensate for all the damage. So as we explained, we consider that marital separation is fundamentally a private risk because the origin of the realization of the event is the spouse themselves. Nevertheless, we also consider that the risk presents some social dimensions which justifies the intervention of the state, and it's the point of the next picture. So according to us, there are 2 main reasons which justify the intervention of the state in the coverage of the cost of divorce. The first reason is that divorce is a risk with a social nature, in the sense that it results in negative social externalities for the society, a risk of poverty related to the phenomenon of single parenthood, which is considered in social policies as a true social risk. And the second negative externalities is the risk of gender and economic inequalities, in the sense that the loss of the living standard is in average, is much more dramatic for women than for men. And these 2 negative externalities could justify the intervention of the state in order to reduce this type of externalities. And the second reason of the legitimacy of the intervention of the state is the fact that we can consider that individuals are not necessarily well equipped to face this type of damages, and we can list the different reasons of this lack of equipment to cover against this type of risk. And we can consider that to help people to to improve their coverage, the state could interfere in the regulation of the private management of the economic consequences of separation. So if we consider that the intervention of the state in the coverage of the divorce cost is legitimate, the question which is interested to study is the question of the characteristics of such state intervention.
5 minutes.
Okay. And in this paper, we show that the main role of the state in this field is the role of regulation. And we make a distinction between two types of regulation, a kind of ex post regulation and an ex ante regulation. The first one, the ex post regulation, refers to the regulation which has an influence on the amount of the level of compensation after the divorce. And we show that the public choices play a key role on the way the divorce costs are shared between different possible funders. This type of regulation concerns two fields, the social protection or the family law. And we can show that the field of regulation can be, well, the regulation tools could be the social insurance mechanisms or the social assistance mechanisms. In the social insurance, we have in mind the rules in terms of pension entitlements. As for the social assistance, we have in mind the mechanisms targeted on poor people. As for family law, there are plenty of tools which that can interfere in the amount of the compensation. As for the social protection and the intervention of the state in this field, the insurer is finally the collectivity because the social insurance and the social assistance are funded by taxes and social contributions, whereas when the states frames the family law, it frames the contribution of the wealthier spouse. As for the ex ante regulation, we are talking about action for the states which influences the magnitude of losses in the event of divorce. And the intervention we are thinking about are interventions which aims at reducing the losses in the event of divorce. And if the state tries to fulfill these objectives, it can use the social fiscal system to produce some incentives in order to promote the female activity with taxation, to promote an equal sharing of the domestic tax with the parental leave, or it could also promote the education of women in order to incite them to stay in the labor market. And I arrive to my last slide. So according to us, the main result of our analysis is the capacity to the fact that we managed to identify the nature of the role of the three key players in social protection, in the coverage of the economic cost of divorce, the state, the family, and the market. And if we had the opportunity to continue this study, we would go into two directions. The first one would be to conduct a detailed analysis of the different tools for a range of countries. And the point would be to study the overall coherence or incoherence of the different tools used in these different types of country. And the second direction would be from this empirical experience and national experiences. The point would be to build a kind of typology of divorce risk coverage regimes. And the question we could ask is the typology of Esping understand concerning the social protection could work for the divorce risk? Can we can we see in the, for instance, in the European scene, the liberal countries, the social-democrat countries, and the South countries, and the conservative countries do these 4 categories work in terms of divorce coverage risk? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lucille. So, are there any people? We have 10 minutes for questions and comments. Please raise your blue hand if you want to make a comment or ask a question. I'm looking for blue hands. I don't see any. Well, I kind of like that because I want to make comments and ask questions. So I'll use again my privilege. On your first slide, you write that your work was basically looking at the grounds for alimony. And this was done a few years ago, but we are in a period, and this has been going on for a long time, decades, in which alimony is basically disappearing. Less and less divorce or separations lead to alimony, and in most Western rich countries, as you say, when they are granted, usually it's only for a few years only as a transition. There are still places where, at least in theory, alimony may be paid for a long period. UK, Germany, for instance, maybe others. But in most countries, it's really becoming obsolete or really short term. So how would you think the topology of the management of divorce risk in a context where basically alimony is disappearing or becoming rare?
Well, there are perhaps, well, we can have two ways of answering. The first one would consist in saying that if alimony disappears, it's because there is no grounds for paying alimony, because the women, well, the economic cost of divorce is more or less, is more and more scarce, because women continue to work, and when there is a separation, the consequences are quite similar between the men and the women, and there is no grounds for granting alimony. It could be the first way of answering. So the fact, in this case, the coverage is granted by the individuals. The women maintain their position on the labor market, and by this way, it's a way of covering the case of a divorce. And the second answer could be that if alimony disappears, it's not because there is no ground for alimony, it's because women don't ask for alimony. And whereas they could ask for alimony because they continue to be more damaged by divorce risk. And for instance, in France, we have the impression that if alimony, perhaps it's not less and less granted, I think that about 20% of the divorce result in an alimony. Yeah. And the fact we could hope that more than 20% of the divorce could result in alimony if we have a look on the consequences of alimony on the living standard of people. So we could think about, in this case, who is in charge of the consequences of divorce.
I mean, there are
You're
no,
surprised by the figure.
well, there are no more.
Soshana asked the word. Soshana.
Okay,
Yes,
so
hi. I have a question of pursuing the point that was made by Benoit. Why would it be the case that in Germany, for example, comparing Germany and the United States, in Germany, I understand they are more likely to grant alimony payments than in the United States, where it's typically the case that it's a temporary thing for at the most a couple of years. So the assumption is until the woman gets a good job and so forth. So what do you have any hypothetical explanations in terms of
To
your
explain the difference of country of granting between the United States and Germany.
Yes.
Well, I think it's not the point of our paper. Our paper is just to think about the characteristics of the tools and to have the point. Our point was, what is the contribution of alimony in the covering of the divorce cost? Because in France, for the legal academics, alimony is a kind of very well, they don't have in mind that it's one tool among others to protect women against the consequences of divorce. And we wanted to relativize, to compare the contribution of alimony with the other contribution. And we wanted to make judges think that if they reduce alimony, who is going to cover this cost? And it was important to make to draw the landscape, the whole landscape of covering. But I can't answer your question, your precise question, because I think that it's rather the sociological, it's rather the academics in history or in sociology. We could give some piece of explanations to explain why in Germany there is a kind of the maintenance of the alimony, whereas in the United States it's a kind of device which is less and less used by the judges.
Right. Can I answer? Is it okay? Can I? So it I would speculate, given some of the other things we know about Germany versus the United States, that in Germany traditionally there seems to have been more of an assumption that it's very important for children to be raised by their mother. And so it's possible that some countries are willing to institute more alimony or are more reluctant to phase out the alimony system because they place more value on the parenting by the parents, in particular, not necessarily the mother, but whereas other countries are more willing to have the state take the place of the child care role.
That's why I think it would be interesting to have, with this type of grid of reading, to have a look on each specific countries to have a total picture of the different intervention from the states, the alimony, the insurance, the employment rate of the women, to have a whole picture and to see if the countries are coherent or perhaps incoherent in the way of covering the divorce cost.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting project. I encourage you to pursue it.
Thanks.
Is there anyone else who wants to make a comment, ask a question? It seems no. So again, I apologize for not presenting the paper. I thought I would be able to finish in time. Thanks to the two presenters, the papers were really interesting, and although they were extremely different. The next session will be on November 4th, and it will be basically about what happens in common law countries. And I repeat my invitation to Eva. There will be a publication based that will be grouping as many as possible contributions from to the sessions. So you're invited to propose your paper to this publication. And just before we sign out, I'll just make some kind of a reminder or advertising for our IUSSP panel on family demography and family law. You all know about it, but apparently it's worth reminding that the panel exists and will be existing for some time. The steering committee of the panel is made of 6 people. 7, including me. So it's Laura Bernardi from Université de Lausanne, Minya Cho, who is with us this morning from the East-West Center in Hawaii, Céline Lebordet, who is there from McGill University, Noah Sanchez-Gasson from Sweden. She's from Germany, but she's now living in Sweden, and she's on a parental leave, so she's not with us this morning. Davis Shekhar from the International Institute for Population Studies in India, hi TV, and Joyce Medoveira from Unicamp. At least we've got one of our students with us this morning. So, and the 2 other people who are linked with the panel are Paul Monet, who was with us a few minutes at the beginning, and Susanna Kamenegi, which is our liaison officer, and she's been with us for all the session. So thank you again to the 2 presenters. The papers were really interesting, and we meet again on November 4th.
Benoit,
I think Susanna wants to add something.
I just want to add a thank for everyone. We know from IUSSP this is a difficult time, and for IUSSP it's very good to know that you went ahead and transformed the personal meeting to this webinar. We know it's very difficult, but we have some advantages we can take from that is that this is being recorded and is going to be available for some people that we can make available later and make this a good material for later. So thank you all. Benoit, thank you very much for putting this together and going ahead. We know it's going to be very difficult. It's a long time for us to be engaged, but I really appreciate from talking as in the name of the IUSSP, the time you had put into this, and we hope that this is going to be a very good opportunity to have this brainstorm together. We are going to be for several days, and we hope this works for the best, taking the hard times we are living now.
Thank you, Susanna. And I'll just finish, if there's no other intervention, by thanking publicly Julie. I wouldn't have been able to organize the sessions without her help. So see you on November 4th, and thanks to everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.